Okay, so we are doing the junk journal today, and this is the example of that is the Jiffy box that I used as the cover, and then the inside are pages from an old uh, catalog, I guess, clothing catalog that I've used as kind of my base for that. One question that was just asked is the page of the inside paper or the size of the inside paper compared to the cardboard that we're going to be using. And so one of the things I want to point out with this book is that if I open it up, you can see that my bottom cover sticks out a little bit from the pages. And so the reason I do that is because it kind of looks like aesthetically looks a little nicer. But the truth is you can make it line up with that cardboard piece. There's nothing wrong with that. It really boils down to what you like. I like it slightly inside because when it's closed, I don't have that paper sticking out of the edges. And I just like the way that looks. So when it comes to figuring out what size paper you want to use, and what size cardboard you want to use for the cover, you really want to keep it in similar size, right? Either slightly smaller like mine is here or the exact same size. Right? And so we'll go ahead and gather our supplies for today. I've got a mac and cheese box that I'm going to be using as my cover. And then I've got I'm going to move this. I've got some book pages from an old torn book that I'm going to use as my inside pages. All right. But the first thing I'm going to do is look at my cover here. This is how I'm going to start. And I'm using a mac and cheese box as my cover. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by doing a folded punch stitch. And so if I look at my illustrated instructions here, the supplies that I need are going to be that inside paper and that cover paper. Here, it's just any kind of cardboard or like watercolor paper. A stiffer paper is helpful when it comes to the cover. So any kind of, like I said, stiffer paper or box will work well for that cover. But what we're going to do, that first step, is taking those pages and cutting them to the size of our cover. And so in the illustration, I drew the pages slightly smaller than the cover. And again, that's just because that's kind of what I like. If you want to make it that exact same size, it looks good that way too. So let's go ahead and start off by doing that. I'm going to kind of cut my box here and make it the size I want it to be. So I'm going to kind of make it just a little smaller. Actually, I may just do the whole thing. Yeah. So I'm going to kind of fold my box and make it flat. And this is where something like that bone folder comes in handy because you can kind of press it and make it flat. It helps with that crease. So if you do have your kit that came in the mail, pull out that bone folder and go ahead and flatten those edges. Crease them down. If you don't have a bone folder, like I said, the base of the scissors works well too. And we're just kind of flattening that box. I'm going to be using the cover of my mac and cheese box, or the front of the mac and cheese box as my front cover. And then the back of the box will be, of course, the back cover. And so what I'm going to do is, now that I have it flat, I'm going to go ahead and cut it down. So I'm going to cut off the edges. And this is where you can make it whatever size you like. If you want a smaller book, or if you want a larger one, depending on the size of the box that you're using, you can make your size that way, the size of your book that way. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of cut down the end. Just kind of cut that off. So I've got, this will be the bottom of my book. And then I'm going to go to the top and cut it off as well. And again, you can make it whatever size you like. If you want a smaller book, I like the smaller books because they're easier to hold and work with. But any size you feel comfortable with is good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the fold on one side, but I'm going to cut off the fold on the other. So I'm just going to kind of cut it down. And so I have my piece of cardboard here, that I can open up, right? I've got mac and cheese on the front, and then I've got the back of it there, but I've got that crease, that main crease in the center. So go ahead, if you have your supplies, if you have your pieces with you, go ahead and cut out that cover. We've got about the size we want for those cardboard pieces, cardboard covers. So our next step is to kind of make the pages, those inside pages, fit the size of our cover. So I'm going to be using a few pages of paper here. And I'm just going to kind of fold them in half. So if you have your inside paper, whatever paper you want to use for this, go ahead and fold them in half. And you can do as many as you like. I'm just going to fold up probably 10 pages. And just make sure I crease those pages. You can do more inside paper than that if you like, or do fewer. There's no rule as to how many we need to use. Let's see how many I have here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm going to do one more. I'll do 8 pages. Okay. So I've got 8 pieces of paper that I folded in half. And so all I'm going to do is kind of stack them inside each other. So after you get your pages folded in half, go ahead and stack them inside. And so if you're doing the same number of pages as me, we started off with 8 pieces of paper, but now that it's folded, we have 16 pages. So our pages have doubled there. So you can notice with my book here that my cover is smaller than my paper pages, and that's okay because what I'm going to do is kind of trim it down, right? And so I'm going to decide which part of my paper I want to see, and I kind of like these torn pages at the top, so I'm going to leave that for my book. And so I'm just going to kind of measure how I want my book to look. I'm just going to make a mark for myself. I'm going to put the paper inside my book, lining my creases up. And so what I'm going to mark, is where I need to cut off those excess pages, excess paper. And so I've got those pages lined up. And I'm just going to make a mark of where I need to cut. All right. So once you've made your mark, should have done a different color. I drew black on top of black. That's not smart. So what I'm going to do is start off by cutting that first one. And just cut those edges off. I should have drawn it differently so I can see that bottom line. There you go. Just kind of trim your paper till it's the size you want. And it may take a minute. Take your time with it. I always joke about, and I may have heard me say it before, feeling like my road to becoming an artist was the same road to becoming a hoarder, because I always end up saving so much of like scraps and things like that because I feel like I can use it. And I was just thinking, these pages that I'm cutting off on the bottom would make another nice little book to have. So I will be saving my scraps as well. But go ahead and start trimming all those pages, and it may take a minute. So it's okay to take your time with it. And just make them all similar in size. I know sometimes it feels better to have like a ruler or a paper cutter. If you have those, definitely use them. Sometimes it's a little easier to cut straighter lines that way. I'm just going through cutting my pages, making sure those creases are lined up. I'm just trimming it. It's nice. I think there's something that's really nice about using scrap pages. I know when I'm doing like a sketch, making a sketchbook or something like that, or a journal for like poetry or any kind of writing, definitely better using unmarked pages, like copy paper or writing paper or something like that. But I think there's something nice about using things like junk mail and old book pages, newspaper pages, things that we see as not usable or like something to throw away or recycle. It's kind of like giving it a new life or a new story. So go ahead and kind of trim your pages up. I'm going to get my trash out of the way. Now, our next step, we're going to use some of the supplies from the kit that came in the mail. And again, if your kit hasn't come yet, there are a couple things that you can use instead. The awl is what we're going to start using now to kind of poke the holes. But again, if you have like an ice pick, a push pin, a safety pin, thumbtack, things like that, those work well also. Just something that has a point that you can put a hole in. So I'm going to take those pages that I've cut. And again, let me know if I need to slow down or repeat anything. But after I've got my pages, my inside paper is cut, I'm going to stick it inside my book. So you can see we've got it trimmed down. So all that's showing are like the edges, the cover edges. And then my book, my inside pages are just nestled inside, right? And so I have the crease of my pages, inside pages, is right against that crease of my cover. So I'm going to open my book up, making sure all those creases are lined up. If we look at those illustrated instructions, that next step is to poke those holes. If you have, like, if you're working just off like a kitchen table or something like that, sometimes it's good to have like a piece of cardboard so you don't scuff up the table. Find that helpful sometimes for sure. But what we're going to do is we're going to poke two holes in this book, right? And I know sometimes it's hard to know where to put those holes. And so one of the tricks that I do to make sure that the holes are equal to the top and bottom is I'll take my finger and stick it, that first crease of my finger, stick that on the edge. Stick it on the edge and then poke the hole at the tip of my finger. So that gives me like the right length. And so I'm going to start by poking that hole all the way through. You want to obviously be careful with it and make sure you're not stabbing your own finger. But I'm just taking that awl and pushing it through that crease of my inside paper till it comes out the outside paper or the outside cover. And sometimes it helps to kind of stick it through a couple times and wiggle it just a little. Okay. And so you can see the paper, there's a little hole that goes all the way through, right? It's good to hold the inside paper against the cover, at least when you're making, like starting it, because you know then those holes are going to be lined up, right? So I'm going to do the other side as well. I've got the hole on one side. So I'm going to take my finger, again, do that same measurement, that first line of my finger, and I'm going to go in and poke that hole at that fingertip and just stick it all the way through. And so you can see with my book here, I have two holes and they're about that same distance from the end. I'm going in about an inch. If you're doing a bigger book, the size of my book is like a 4 by 5 size book. So if you're doing a bigger book, you may want to go in a little further to poke your hole. But for about this size, about an inch is a good measurement to go in. So once we've got those holes poked, I have my outside cover, my inside papers all lined up. What I'm going to do now is start to thread that book. So I'm going to set my all aside. The embroidery floss, I have a tapestry needle here, and the embroidery floss that I'm going to use. Now, you can use any type of string or thread, a thin yarn works, embroidery floss. Sometimes you can get twine that work well. We don't need a whole lot. So just one skein of embroidery floss is more than enough. But you want to pull out about a foot of the embroidery floss. We don't need a lot because, again, we're doing just a simple punch stitch today. And so I'm going to pull out about a foot of my embroidery floss and trim it. And this is what I'm going to use to tie my book together. Okay. Now, like I said, a punch stitch is very simply punching two or three holes in there and then threading through a string. It's a very simple, very basic bookbinding technique, and it's a really good first one to get into. So if you haven't done any bookbinding before, this is like the ideal stitch to learn. So looking at our illustrated instructions, to do that binding part, we're going to pass that thread with the tapestry needle through those two holes. And what I'm going to do is kind of make sure those tails of that embroidery floss are on the cover side, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and thread my tapestry needle here. And I'm going to start on the outside of my book and just stick it through that hole. Thread it all the way through to the front. And I'm going to make sure I leave that tail. So go ahead, if you're threading it through, leave that tail hanging there. And then I'm going to thread it through the next hole going out to the cover. Okay. Everyone see that? So now for the inside, I have a strip of the embroidery floss. And on the outside, I have those two tails. Everyone see that? I'm going to do that one more time just so we can see. So when I do that bookbinding step, I'm going to start on the outside of my book, and I'm going to thread it through from outside to inside, and then from inside to outside. So I'm just taking that needle with that tapestry or embroidery floss, that tapestry needle, just threading it through. Oh, there we go. Threading it through from the outside cover to the inside pages, pulling it through, but leaving that tail hanging. And then I'm going to go from those inside pages to that outside cover. So both the tails of that embroidery floss are sticking out. Everyone see that? So this is that basic stitch, right? Like I said, it's a great first bookbinding stitch to learn because it's just a couple steps. It's literally punching holes and threading that string through, right? And so if we look, I'm going to hold this carefully. On the inside, I have that strip of embroidery floss, right? And so on the outside, I have those two tails. Now, this is a fun place to be in because once you get the two tails, if you want to add something like embellishments like beads or something like that, you can add that here. Um, but if you don't want to add like any embellishments, which I'm not going to do for mine, we're just going to kind of tie those strings together. Pull it somewhat tight and just kind of tie those strings. Like I said, we don't need a whole lot of embroidery floss for this first stitch. You just want to make sure it's kind of tight. And I'm going to do a few knots. One of the things that I like doing too, and you don't have to do this. I like adding a tiny little bow. Makes it a little cute, I think. Cute little bow. But you can just tie that knot and then trim the edges. So now I can close my book and I have those pages.